Hi, my name's Ash.
And I'm Callie.
And welcome to Paved with Gold, the eating disorder recovery podcast. I would like to acknowledge the traditional landowners on which Callie and I are recording and extend the same respect to the traditional custodians of the lands from which you are all listening. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Now, y'all are in for a real treat today. This is an episode that we have been wanting to do as soon as we both decided, let's do this podcast. It is a topic that is not talked about nearly enough and one that we absolutely could not talk about ourselves. So we needed to bring in someone that we knew could not only do the topic justice, but set the bloody standard for these types of conversations. Our guest today is a fierce fat activist, feminist advocate, and content creator. She is the author of The Fat Positive Framework, and she regularly speaks out on anti-fat bias and eating disorder treatment, but also anti-fatness in general. If you have followed Callie or the pod on socials, it should come as no surprise that we are huge fans of this guest, and it is our great pleasure to welcome to the podcast, Nic McDermid.
Yay! Hello, thank you so much for having me. It's so exciting to talk to you both.
Oh, we are so excited to chat. I mean, I've been following you for a while, and it's been so eye-opening. It's been so uncomfortable in like a good way, in terms of like challenging everything, because let's be honest, nothing good happens in your comfort zone, right? And it's been so just really interesting to sort of see things from your perspective and the point of view that you sort of bring to this space. And it's stuff like, oh, I didn't even think about that. Yeah, that is terrible. Things like that. It's been so, it's been a long time coming having you on this podcast, and we're so excited that the day is here.
Excellent. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a while since I've recorded a podcast, so I'm hoping I'm not too rusty.
I don't think it comes as any surprise how much I love you, but
thanks, Cal.
No, but also as a practitioner, you inform a lot of my work. I've done your course. I've engaged in your supervision because I just think that if you are working within the space, that should be a non-negotiable. Mm-hmm. It's sad that it's not a non-negotiable, and that, I do not believe you can work with humans in this space without doing this really important work. And you inform all of the work I do on a daily basis. So I am obviously very excited to be talking to you today.
So let's start off as, again, we often do on this podcast, with you telling us a little bit about your lived experience with an eating disorder, and where did it all start for you?
That's a really tough question, I think, and one that I've pondered for a long time, and one that I still don't know has a definitive answer. I was only diagnosed with an eating disorder when I was 25, I think. I grew up as a fat child. I was in a bigger body my entire life. I was a fat child, I was a fat teenager, and I was a fat adult. And, that came with a lot of challenges, which I anticipate we will get into a lot more. But, it came with a lot of challenges and a lot of bullying and discrimination and just downright hatred and, people always trying to fix your body by, prescribing weight loss or, going to the doctor for a common cold but walking out with information on a new diet, for instance. And it was at one point where I had decided that I was going to, quote unquote, get healthy, and ended up losing quite a significant amount of weight. And that pretty much spiraled really quickly, actually, into some really unhealthy practices. And so I finally ended up with an eating disorder diagnosis of atypical anorexia, the one that we all know and love.
Anorexia nervosa with weight stigma attached to it.
Eye roll. Massive eye roll.
That's exactly right. It's anorexia with a side of fatphobia.
That too.
So it kind of started there, and then, in and out of treatment, which wasn't effective whatsoever, because it was just the wrong kind of treatment that I needed at the time. But it was, I comply with that or nothing.
Yeah.
obviously through treatment and beginning to kind of nourish my body again, surprise, surprise, my body changed weight and shape. So yeah, my body has obviously changed a lot since that particular point, 12, 13 years ago. And, my body's kind of gone back to the size that it was pre-diagnosis of an eating disorder. But, thinking as long back to when I was a kid, those I guess those typical signs of when you're being deprived of something, right? Like if you're being deprived of foods that are quote unquote unhealthy or quote unquote bad foods, they're the types of foods that you're going to reach to when you have an opportunity to do it.
Totally. Yeah.
And so, it was no surprise that at like friends' birthday parties and that sort of thing, like I would capitalize on the fact that there's all of this delicious food there that I was not being offered. Or, when there was food like that in the house, it was like hoarding that food. Or, when I started working and was able to, purchase things for myself, it was like hoarding a lot of that food. And and I mean, I don't know that I can kind of pinpoint a spot where I can say that it all began. I think, my eating disorder and disordered eating patterns were such a result of me growing up in a fat body.
Absolutely.
And the discrimination and such that, that is attached to that.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Like, how do you pinpoint a starting stage when it has literally been your entire life of being bullied, absolutely thrashed because of your body size, simply because of your body size?
Yeah.
How do you pinpoint a start to that when that's just been your entire life?
Absolutely.
You were almost born into a body that society deemed completely unacceptable. It's like, well, great. What am I supposed to do with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Like that doesn't come with an instruction manual. Like I remember times where I was at high school and, I was probably 14 or 15 at the time. And there was a group of guys that just like every time they would see me, it was just relentless. And there were a period of a couple of weeks where they like hoarded heaps of fruit between them and they would throw those pieces of fruit at me across the quad and yelling out, eat a piece of fruit, bitch, or eat a piece of fruit, fatty, or whatever, whatever iteration of that it was. And yeah, it's like that stuff stays with you. That stuff
Of course,
yeah.
And I think even now, right? The stuff that's happened to you, like is happening to you today online, the bullying and harassment you get for simply existing online, it just baffles me, I think, hearing that story about the boys at school. Like, how, as human beings, do people not see that as a problem? How do they continue the bullying and the harassment? Surely they can know that that's not okay, that is just horrific.
I think when you grow up in a fat body, people deem you completely incapable of quote unquote looking after yourself or taking care of yourself. And people think that they have a right over your body and have a right to tell you what to do with your body because it doesn't fit their idea of what is acceptable. It's an odd thing and something that I've processed a lot in therapy, but obviously a lot more to go in terms of how has it been where people have felt like they have more access to my body than I do. Yeah, which is a really strange and vulnerable and quite traumatic experience to be in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I feel like it's something we can get into maybe a bit later, but it's funny, we were talking to Aubrey, one of our guests we interviewed yesterday, about children and, the ideas and the diet culture that we're already putting on children. And we were actually talking about what I have noticed within motherhood and mothers around me with children and the stuff that they already are putting on their child. Like I read something yesterday about a child that's the same age as my daughter, so 15 months old, and she's asking online, my daughter's 15 months old, she's X weight, is she overweight? And it's like, why is that even a thought process that's going through your mind? I get it. Like, you're a victim of, what you've been taught as well. But she's 15 months old. Like, why are we already putting this on our children at 15 months old? So what you say, like, you probably can't pinpoint a time.
Yeah.
Of course you can't, because probably at 15 months old, like, apparently actually, as a newborn, apparently that's when it starts.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I grew up, in a household. It was just my mum and I. My dad passed away when I was 5 months old. So I grew up with mum being a single parent. And, she was also in a bigger body and was in a bigger body when she was a kid. And there were constant, like, diet attempts and, constant attempts at losing weight. And because it was just her and I, if she was on a diet, subsequently I was too, because she wasn't cooking 2 meals or whatever it was. And so, I learnt very quickly, and I probably learnt to count Weight Watchers points before I learnt to ride a bike properly.
Oh, Nic.
Oh boy. Yeah.
And it's funny because I think it's just so out of the realms of, like, obviously from what I've learned and from, being your friend and talking to you and learning from you, I've learned about the realities of it, right? But being in a privileged body myself and having never been in a fat body, I've always been in a privileged body. It's just, for most people, I think that sort of stuff is out of the realms of, like, even their thought process, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. They don't want to consider that sort of stuff is fat folks' reality.
Yeah.
You touched on briefly about how when you were going through eating disorder treatment, and how it just was not, it wasn't exactly treatment that was helpful. It wasn't helpful for you, right? And you're very vocal today in, about anti-fat bias and fat phobia existing in the eating disorder recovery space. And it is definitely something that isn't talked about and needs to be talked about. Can you, if you're able to, can you talk a bit about some of the things you've experienced and the impact that actually had on your recovery?
Yeah, absolutely. The beginning stage of me, quote unquote, going to any sort of structured eating disorder treatment was a day program. And at that particular point, I was in a very privileged body, but still on the quote unquote, and BMI is completely bullshit. I just want to preface what I'm saying with,
Absolutely.
I think it's completely bullshit.
Anyone who's listened to this podcast knows exactly how we feel about the BMI.
But, and I guess this just speaks to the question that you asked, Ash, like, BMI was something that tracked our progress through treatment. Like, we didn't get to know what our weight was at that particular point, but we got to know in our discharge letters what our BMI was.
Seriously?
Yeah, like, it was just bizarre.
It's weird, and it's different from, like, place to place as well. Like, sometimes it will be you do get to know your weight, and then other places it's like you get a choice, and then other places like you do not, or you get to know your BMI. Like, it's just like, we can't even agree on that. Like,
yeah, it's just so inconsistent. But I was still in a very privileged body, but was on the upper end of the, healthy,
quote unquote,
whatever that means, BMI scale according to my discharge letter. And so I really struggled in eating disorder treatment at that particular point with a lot of the expectations around, like, thought challenging and behavioral experiments, because it was very CBTE focused. There was no straying either side of a strict CBTE protocol. And in doing the behavioral experiments where, we would go out to a cafe for afternoon tea and we would have to order a piece of cake or a quote unquote fun food. I fucking hate that term.
I hate that term too.
all food's fun, unless I don't like it, because then it's not fun.
Yeah, it's like, okay.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
But I distinctly remember sitting in the lounge room, filling out that piece of paper beforehand about what we predicted would happen and, et cetera, et cetera. And I remember one of the first behavioral experiments that I did, I was writing down the fact that I was scared that people were going to look at me and look at me with disgust in going out and ordering a piece of cake or something that quote unquote is unhealthy. I will say quote unquote a lot because
That's
I'm being
fun.
sarcastic when I'm saying these things. And whoever it was that was leading that group was like, Nic, that's very unlikely that, that's going to happen. Can you challenge those thoughts? And I'm like, that's actually been my reality for the last like 20 odd years.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
you have evidence for that.
Absolutely. Like there is legitimate evidence.
You can't just eradicate that.
Exactly. And so like there was this very like there was just this propensity to just dismiss any sort of like systemic oppression or any kind of like marginalized identities that would contribute to a person's experience with food and their body and how they're seen in public and how they experience and how they interact with the world. There was just a complete dismissal of that, and everything was like basically, oh, it's your eating disorder. It's your eating disorder getting in the way. You have to challenge it.
And just denying that fat phobia exists at all.
Absolutely. And like at that stage, I didn't really have vocabulary for it myself. And I was still in a privileged body at that point. So like I didn't really feel like I could.
It's funny, isn't it? I think you speak about it a lot, Nic. I think we've spoken about it a lot together, that I guess the idea of trauma-informed always, A, but also B, individuality to a person's treatment. Why couldn't that person have been like, I hear that that's a really very real thought for you. Do you want to talk about it?
Like, where did this thought come from?
Absolutely.
It's as simple as that. Like, you don't have to, like, since when have you been, XYZ, I'm having XYZ thought, it's really hard. Oh, have you thought about not thinking that?
Yeah.
Have you thought about just being happy?
Oh, well, thank you for that. Like, yeah, maybe I'll do that now. Thank you. And it's like, can I just talk about it? Because actually it's very real. It's been your experience. It's a very real fear because that's what has happened to you in the past.
Yep. Absolutely. And like the day program that I was at, it was pretty much the only program that, I was able to access at that given time. And there was obviously, I was kind of back and forth over a number of years. And as I'm kind of coming in and out of treatment because, I was thinking that I was failing and, I needed to try harder or whatever it was. It couldn't possibly be the fact that like the treatment that I was getting was completely ineffective and completely wrong for what I needed at the time. But obviously my body was getting bigger and my weight was increasing. And so there was another point at which I went back to this same day program, and every Monday morning was weigh morning. And so we would have to strip down to our underwear and put on one of those really shitty paper hospital gowns and step on the scales. Those shitty paper hospital gowns didn't even do up around my body. I was standing on the scales, and at that point they'd changed the protocol, so we had to look at our weight. And so here I was standing on the scales in a gown that like barely covered the sides of my boobs. My butt was hanging out the back. Like I was completely exposed and vulnerable in that sense. And they're making me look at my weight, which had increased significantly at that particular point. And then they sat you down once you'd gotten dressed, and then they would plot your BMI on a scale. And so I was like, what the actual fuck is going on here? Like, I am in a parallel universe. This is horrible.
It's barbaric.
And then the same treatment stint, they had changed my meal plan without telling me, based on the fact that my weight trends upwards when I'm in treatment. So to sit down at morning tea and only get an apple in front of me instead of the snacks that everybody else got at the table.
I was going to say, what did everyone else have in front of you? And I think even with the weigh-in situation, who else was around you when you were having to do that? I bet you their hospital gowns fit, didn't they?
100%. And then I remember crying through that morning tea, not because I was scared of what was put in front of me, but because I was utterly ashamed and embarrassed at the fact that my snack in comparison was like, okay, here you go, you're giving the fat girl an apple. Like,
right? Yeah.
And I mean, not to be like, oh, won't somebody please think of the thin people? But, also what message then does that then say to everyone else there?
Yeah, absolutely. Don't get fat. Don't put on too much weight because then that's going to be you.
100%.
And I mean, when you are going through that process of refeeding, that fear of, oh, if I'm just going to keep eating, and then I'm going to get fat, and then that's the worst thing ever. Yeah. And then you're doing that in front of everybody else. It's like, okay, so you're telling us that
I'm to be feared.
Exactly. Which is, that's so
well, it's like the line, Nick, of, oh, don't worry, we won't let you get fat.
Yes.
Absolutely. And like, I heard that on one too many occasions in treatment. Like, after the apple saga, I was so upset. Like, I was inconsolable crying, and in taking it to the dietitians at the time and saying, like, what the hell? This is like, I feel about this big right now.
Yeah.
And I got told not to question. Like, don't question the authority.
Oh, my God.
Like, how dare I ask,
It's this gross sort of trend where it's almost as if the eating disorder patients aren't to be trusted.
Exactly.
And that eating disorder patients aren't allowed to have boundaries, and they aren't allowed to be informed of their treatment. And
or make choices in it.
Exactly. And I mean, there may come situations sometimes, depending on the scenario, where that is sometimes appropriate. It's very individual based, but then to have that sort of blanket, no, you're not allowed to know, don't question, you're not to be trusted. It's just, it's so dehumanizing.
Yeah, it was just a really horrible experience of and like sitting in groups and stuff as well of talking about body image and people's fears of gaining weight, and I'm like, how are the facilitators not regulating this discussion? Because at the moment everybody's fucking worst nightmare is looking like me.
Absolutely. Yeah.
This is not okay. Sitting here when the facilitators are literally saying if your BMI is outside a certain range, then you're in the quote unquote unhealthy or the, heaven forbid, the O ranges. But saying that in an eating disorder group, I find is just absurd, and not to mention incredibly harmful.
Absolutely.
But so common.
So common. Absolutely. Absolutely. Any eating disorder provider working in the space has a responsibility to be able to interrogate their own bias and interrogate their own understanding of what it means to hold certain beliefs about certain bodies, and not just with fat bodies, but with any kind of marginalized bodies. So, for people in the LGBTQIA plus community, and, how eating disorders disproportionately affect like trans and gender diverse folks, and, people with with ADHD and autism, and how eating disorders again disproportionately affect those folks, and how manualized treatments like CBTE are completely ineffective and harmful because a neurodiverse brain is built differently.
God forbid.
I know.
I wondered if we could touch on, Nick, a little bit about your neurodivergency and how maybe that has shown up in treatment, because I know that you were diagnosed, was it last year?
Yeah, so kind of October last year, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm wondering if we could have a chat about that, because as a neurodivergent myself, it's really funny looking back on treatment. And, again, I had a very privileged view of treatment, but in the sense of my neurodivergency, it was very much never working for me because my brain didn't work that way. And actually, the way that I was eating a particular food, or the fact that I wanted to eat the same food every day for morning tea, was not an eating disorder behavior.
Yeah.
It was because that was my neurodivergency.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And to be completely honest, like, I was officially diagnosed with ADHD like back in October, but it had been something that
for a long time.
Yeah, like my GP and I had been talking about it for years, and then like I finally, bit the bullet, so to speak, and sourced a diagnosis.
Yeah.
And then, I've been doing lots of talk with my psychologist and dietitian and doctor about the fact that I'm also likely autistic. And so it's been a bit of a wild ride to look back at my relationship with food and my relationship with my body, and how viewing that now through a neurodivergent lens and looking back on the fact that a lot of my eating disorder treatment was very neuronormative, figuring out where those like disconnects were. And Cal, as you said, like eating the same food, or eating the same sort of food that has similar textures, or sensory seeking with different kinds of food and that sort of thing, aren't necessarily inherently eating disorder behaviors. I even hate that term. Like,
what does that mean? Like,
it really winds me up.
I had to have a massive argument with my dietitian when I was in treatment, when I said, look, I don't like milk in cereal. I don't like milk in general. I never have. I've never drank it as from jump.
And it's an eating disorder behavior.
It's like, it's really not. Like, if you put it in front of me, I won't eat it because it's gross, okay? For me, it's gross. But then they're just like, well, that's an eating disorder. It's like, it's not. Stop it.
I'm a
human. Yeah, absolutely. Like, a distinct memory from one of my very first days in eating disorder treatment was at morning tea time, where they gave us Saos with butter and Vegemite. And your face says it all, Cal. That's exactly how I reacted.
I'm just thinking of like the sliminess and the anyway, continue. Yes.
So for anyone listening, a Sao is like it's like
a weird cracker.
It's a cracker. They're blandish sort of crackers. You put stuff on them, you eat them.
Yeah, like they've just got no taste to them whatsoever.
Yeah.
And so I was never a butter eater. Like, I was never a butter eater because I just can't stand the texture of it. It makes me want to gag.
I'm with you. I'm the exact same.
Even talking about it now, I'm like, oh, it's just
the smell of it makes me like, bleh.
Yeah.
Anyway.
And like, not an eating disorder thing at all. Not an eating disorder thing. I even begged them to give me like cream cheese and avocado, which would be, like a pretty substantial, for butter and Vegemite. And I was like, look, I will eat that. Like, I don't care, but just don't make me eat the butter.
Yeah.
And I was pretty much like put into submission to having to eat the butter and Vegemite, and I literally was having to be coached through it because I was wanting to be sick. It was just gross.
That is traumatic.
Yeah.
It was traumatic, and it happened a number of times.
How is that helpful to your recovery, right?
Exactly.
I had a very similar thing where I was on a sort of food challenge, quote unquote. We went to like Boost Juice, right? Boost Juice bar. Then there was a list of ones that you could have, and they all had banana in it. I hate banana. Hate it. Can't stand the taste of it. Can't taste, texture, everything. And I said, and it was, so when I first went into treatment, they gave me a list of, I could pick like 3 to 5 things that were okay for your dislikes. And banana was on it. And I said, look, it's on my dislikes. Everyone knows I don't like banana. I will have the larger size of a flavor that I prefer, which is, again, I will enjoy that more. Why are you going to force me to have something that I'm not going to enjoy, that's going to make me feel sick? And where I'm willing to compromise with you and actually have more than what you're asking me to.
Yeah.
So that this is more enjoyable for me, because there's no circumstance that when I leave this place, I'm going to go out and have that as an option.
Yeah,
This
yeah.
idea that like we were saying before, you're just not to be trusted, you don't understand. And it's this dehumanizing element of treatment sometimes where you've already had to give up so much of your control. And it's not I think we're pretty smart and switched on enough in certain cases, especially to the point where you're actually going out to do these sort of food challenge things, that you're able to distinguish between what is your eating disorder and what is, it's just you saying, no, this doesn't work for me. And I'm allowed to put up this boundary.
Yeah.
And I think that's the key, right? I think this would be a good little intro, Nic, to harm reduction. Can we talk about that? Because that's a nice little, an example of where harm reduction, right?
Absolutely.
You ideally wanted the person to have banana or, butter, whatever, but the person actually really doesn't. Why is this the battle that we're choosing to fight?
Yeah. Why is this important?
Exactly.
I think there's so much about neurodivergence and eating disorders that we don't know. And I think
absolutely
the folks over at Eating Neuro Australia are doing some fabulous work working with the eating disorder organisations in providing education and providing but there's still so much that we don't understand. And something that I was really reflecting on in therapy the other week was that the whole idea of having to eat 3 meals, 3 snacks, 3 hours apart, for me, whenever I'm not achieving that, I feel like I'm being eating disordered. And my therapist said to me the other day, she's like, Nic, did you think that that's the way that you had to eat for the rest of your life? My autistic brain took that was gospel for my autistic brain.
Yeah.
And here I am for the last 10 years beating myself up for the fact that type of regularity, and it just doesn't work for my neurodiverse brain. It literally doesn't work for my ADHD brain. But I was gaslighting myself because that's what I was told was the correct way of not being eating disordered.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It was a moment where I think I just sat there either shocked or in tears in going, holy shit.
Because how many more of those moments can you think of, right?
Absolutely.
I remember the whole mindful, you need to sit down and eat thing.
Yeah.
That doesn't work for me. That is not a thing I can do. I need to eat on the run. I very often need to eat in front of the TV so that, my brain has a distraction because it's, whatever. I need noise around.
Stimulation. Yeah.
But that's not allowed. That's disordered. That's, you need to sit there and be mindful. It doesn't matter what that does to your brain, because that's what we do. That's what we do. And it's it's just not individualized, and it's not trauma informed. It's a really sad state of affairs.
It's not person-centered in the slightest.
Not even close. Yeah. And it's funny, you said something earlier, Ash, about there will be circumstances where I guess people do kind of need to be not told what to do, but they sort of, some of their choice needs to be taken out of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really interesting though because I firmly believe that even if that is the case, I still believe the person can have choice. I still believe there is always a way to have that person at the center of their care, and that it is always not okay to completely take away a person's rights. It doesn't matter where they are in their illness. It doesn't matter how cognitively dissonant you say they are.
Yeah.
They should always be at the center of their care.
Absolutely.
Nic, if you were given the project of overhauling the entire eating disorder treatment model, which I hope you get the brief for any day now, what would you change? I mean, apart from everything, but how would you change sort of the eating disorder treatment model?
Is it really wrong of me to say that I would burn the entire thing to the ground and start again?
That is the perfect answer.
Far more appropriate than what I say probably.
Look, to be completely blunt and completely honest, I think there are far too many people in the eating disorder field who wield so much institutional power, and they have done for so long, that anytime that power is disrupted or rocked in any way, there's retaliation. And the people who are knocking at the door asking for change, there's potential for those people to be completely and utterly, for want of a better word, cancelled, for their careers to be threatened, to put at risk, because there is so much power within the eating disorder field. And
we've spoken about that so much, haven't we, Nic? About that's a fear that I have, because I am genuinely scared of that. If I rock the boat too much, or if I, go down one line too much, my career is going to be destroyed.
Yeah. That is absolutely wild, because if the eating disorder field is instilling that sort of fear in early career practitioners and practitioners who are wanting to ask and demand for change, if the community and the field is instilling that sort of fear in those practitioners, what sort of fear are they instilling in the people that are actually needing support and asking for support?
Absolutely. Yeah.
There's a very few practitioners and very few, practices and organizations that I actually would trust with anybody with an eating disorder. And I think we need to start again. We need to start again with fresh ideas. We need to start again with a trauma-informed approach, with basically looking at systemic oppression, with actually confronting things like racism, fatphobia, homophobia, transphobia, neuronormativity, sexism, misogyny. I'm probably getting a little bit too worked up about this, but
no, I love it. And isn't it funny, because people are being traumatized by eating disorder treatment?
Absolutely.
They are being genuinely traumatized. There are people who have PTSD and CPTSD from eating disorder treatment. That should not be happening.
You shouldn't be going into a facility to treat one mental illness and leave with another.
Exactly.
It's just wild. And exactly as you said, Nic, I actually believe that to some degree, there's obviously still so much further to go, but to some degree, I think a lot of people in this space, the small people in this space that don't have power, I actually believe that they almost have the answer to eating disorder treatment. I don't even believe we need to develop new treatments, because I actually think that there's a lot of really great clinicians and people who don't have power that are actually doing a really great job of it.
Absolutely.
But the thing is that they're silenced. The thing is that they're not listened to. And I just think that that's crazy. We have the answers, but we're just ignoring it completely.
But this is the thing, Cal. Power is what the problem is. It's the fact that people wield power and use power over other people instead of using power alongside people.
Yeah.
That is the problem.
Yeah.
So when you've got clinicians who are de-experting themselves, which is exactly what should be happening, people are experts of their own bodies, even if they are in a situation where they may not have as much choice as possible.
They are still the expert.
Absolutely.
They're still the expert of their own experience. And I think there's so much of eating disorder treatment that takes away people's agency and their ability to be able to set boundaries and speak for themselves, and to be able to give voice to what their experience is, because you're gaslighted so much into believing that that is your eating disorder, that putting those boundaries in place is your eating disorder talking, or that you're being combative, or dare I say it, non-compliant.
People just are not listened to.
Yep.
Because God forbid they have an eating disorder.
Yep.
Absolutely. I hate this notion that this rule, for want of a better word, that eating disorder or traditional gold standard eating disorder treatment has set up, that you have to weight restore or at least nourish your brain enough before you engage in any sort of treatment. And it's can you actually consider that the person actually needs that treatment to feel safe or to feel comfortable?
And it's funny that you say that, because it's something that maybe an area that I love talking about or am passionate. I think we spoke about it yesterday, Ash, about I absolutely think that there's a lot of good in making sure that the person is nutritionally able to do particular work. I don't think, we can't be doing proper trauma work or, really digging deep while somebody is, in a kind of starved state, I guess. However, there is ways to do it, right? Like, yes, they do nutritionally need to rehabilitate, but that doesn't mean that we toss them to the side and like, that's all we, focus on. That's all we talk about. That's,
it needs to be a holistic approach, right?
Yeah, yeah. Like your job is to sit there and literally feed yourself. Like,
and that's it.
what an existence that is for people. But like, you're taking everything else away from them. You're taking away their individuality. You're taking away their agency. You're taking away their support. You're taking away the people that help them feel safe, to feel secure, to feel any kind of like.
I think I was very lucky in the sense that I was able, while I was being nutritionally restored, I was able to sort of unpack exactly how I got there and what led me to this moment, which, I was able to sort of work out and gain insight into that. And then they had sort of the tools laid out for me so that I was able to then, once I'm ready, you can pick these up and then you can start working.
Yeah.
That I think is one way of doing it. But the fact that that is not standard and it's not accessible to everybody and it's also not individualized is, I think, the core of the problem here, right?
Absolutely. And this is where I think manualized treatments, I think everybody that follows me on social media knows my disdain for CBTE. So it's no surprise of what I'm going to say here, but I think manualized treatment approaches like CBTE are exactly what's wrong with the eating disorder field, even though it's considered a quote unquote gold standard eating disorder treatment, because some research that they've done, some biased research that they've done has told them that thin, white, predominantly, able-bodied folk responded reasonably well to this approach. When you're trying to make people fit into boxes rather than supporting people to not actually be put in a box to begin with.
For those who are listening who don't know what CBTE is, could you elaborate? I know we could probably do a whole episode on this, but could you elaborate a little bit on what that is and why it's problematic?
Yeah. Look, CBTE is like an enhanced form of CBT, specifically for eating disorders. And its primary focus is on the relationship between thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, which is the premise of CBTE in any case. And so it is a manualized treatment approach, which often requires clinicians to weigh their clients, which often requires clinicians to go through certain, like it's like a how-to manual, essentially. Like that's what manualized treatment approach is. But the incessant focus on the relationship between thoughts, feelings, and behaviors doesn't really allow for any other kind of discussion. It's solely focused on the eating disorder and the problem that the eating disorder is, rather than actually seeing that the eating disorder could actually be a pretty damn good coping mechanism for trauma, or it could actually be really helpful because a person like is traumatized or is currently going through,
or safer in their body.
Absolutely. Or a response to horrendous fat phobia, like that constant that constant desire for weight loss as a response to horrendous fat phobia. And so it's the problematic side to it is that it doesn't consider individuality. Whilst it purports that it does, it doesn't. It's actually asking people to fit into a mold of treatment rather than molding treatment to fit an individual. And it fails to take into account any kind of marginalization or, any kind of systemic oppression. It's very neuronormative. It's got no wiggle room for any kind of neurodivergence, which can be really hard for people who are neurodivergent because it is very like rigid.
Yeah. Like, as you said, individual treatment models, right?
Yeah.
So there
Yeah.
may be components of CBTE that might work for somebody, but that shouldn't be the only thing that we are using.
Or the gold standard.
Yes, we may use that component, but then we also use other things as well,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It shouldn't ever, in life, we know that there should never just be the one thing that is like the thing that we use.
Yeah.
It should be a combination of everything. And we should have clinicians that are trained in a combination of everything, because when you have a person walk through your door that, is going to be completely different to the person that walked into your door earlier, you've got to be able to adapt and be like, okay, so I'm going to use a different model with you. I'm going to, use pull from here. I'm going to pull from here, because that's what we should be doing.
Absolutely. Or heaven forbid, we actually ask clients that walk through the door what works for them.
Yes. It's just wild. I wonder, I feel like that kind of leads into a question about the idea of recovery, because I know this is something that both you and I are passionate about, because we see these random definitions of recovery, and we definitely see, I guess, a very privileged version of recovery online very frequently. Recovered is a word that I identify with. However, I always say to my clients, I identified as recovered, but that doesn't mean I never have thoughts, which to some people, to them, that's not recovered.
Yes.
Another thing that is entirely individual, and you don't ever have to identify with using the word recovered either. It doesn't make you any less. It doesn't make you any more. That's what feels good, and that's what works for you. So I wanted to have a bit of a chat to you about this idea of recovery, recovered, fully recovered, whatever. Like, recovered is an entire word on its own. Like,
Yeah.
I just wanted to have a chat about it because it makes me angry, and I know it makes you angry.
Yeah. Look, if this could be an entire episode in and of itself as well. I think there are issues which people may or may not be aware of if you followed me on social media, with a certain universal definition of recovery that is often thrown out there in eating disorder spaces because of the person who has put together said universal definition of recovery. I think it's extremely dangerous to have a universal definition of recovery because it doesn't account for individuality. It doesn't account for people's past histories. It doesn't account for what people will experience into their future. It's disconnected. It's very privileged. It's very like, this is an end point, very unrealistic. And you're setting people up to fail realistically.
It also can sometimes probably seem very unattainable. And if you feel like you're constantly going towards this goal, which you don't believe is there, it's almost, it's expecting so much of people, so soon almost, sometimes I think.
Yeah,
absolutely. And it's really unfortunate too, where you see, the presence online of people who have recovered being very one-dimensional in terms of thin, white, able-bodied, access to resources, et cetera, so very much fitting the mold. And so it's really like for people in marginalized bodies and for people who hold multiple marginalized identities, I know for myself, when I see those things, it just makes me really angry, because I know for me that will never be me. That will never be me.
I'm not negating the fact that some people may be completely free from thoughts forevermore. Great, good for you. But that doesn't make you more than, say, me, who, has used an eating disorder as a coping skill from very dangerous situations throughout my life. And now, because I've used it as a coping skill for such a long time, every now and then I'm like, oh, a thought. Doesn't mean I engage in it. Doesn't mean that I, have an eating disorder. It means that that's my brain. I'm susceptible to eating disorders. I think it is incredibly arrogant to think that you are immune after you have recovered, inverted commas, to think that you can never relapse.
Yeah.
Because what happens if it comes back? You could have a massive life-changing moment. We've seen
But
this.
there's a shame spiral with that too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's shameful because I always think about these people that do like, oh, I will never have a thought again. I never. And I'm just like, but what if you do?
Yeah.
Are you going to then be able to seek help?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you've just made that as a shameful kind of thing for yourself. Are you going to be able to speak out and actually get the help you need? Or are you going to be like, oh my gosh, no, I built this idea of recovery for myself and I can never. It's just wild. And I always say to people, like, it's not a bad thing. It's not, I don't feel like burdened by that. I don't feel like I'm not free. It just is.
Yeah.
And I feel really actually privileged by the fact that I'm aware of that and that I get to do for the rest of my life recovery maintenance.
Yeah. It's interesting in terms of, you know, where I've been with, you know, recovering, you know, varying degrees of that. I think, you know, one thing that's kind of been on my mind for the last couple of months is the way that we set up recovery is inherently medicalized and inherently positions that there's something wrong to begin with that we need to recover from.
Yeah, yeah.
And so it's like, if we think from like an abolitionist point of view, for instance, in throwing out the medical model and throwing out all of this, you know, mental health jargon, what if it's just people's way of moving through life?
Yeah.
What if it's just the way that people respond to trauma, to life-changing events, to whatever?
Yeah.
What if people are just okay with that?
People aren't broken.
Absolutely.
And I think it's a common thing, isn't it, Nick, where I guess clinicians always go into working with a client with the view that they're going to get them to reach a stage of recovery, inverted commas. And it's like, I mean, that's not really our job, right? Sure, it'd be great. And we would love to get somebody to a stage of, you know, being able to live their life without being plagued by an eating disorder. However, I don't get to make that decision for you. Like, I will meet you where you're at. And if that's not in the realms of possibility for you right now, if you don't even want to think about recovery right now, that's fine. Let's talk about how we can help you with life.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I worked in the eating disorder space for quite some time, and I was very uneasy with the way that we were requested to position recovery. And, you know, we were always told that, you know, our job was to promote hope and that sort of thing, which I absolutely understand. I think that, you know, anybody going through a hard time, when you're given hope, or, you know, when there's somebody alongside you that can empower you in some way, but it has to be the right way at the right time.
Yeah.
I think that, you know, that is incredibly important. But there's also a sense of, you can tell when that's performative too. And, you know, in working at the time and in having to talk to people about, you know, oh, recovery is possible for everybody. And I'm like, I don't believe that for 1 second, because I didn't believe it for myself, and because it was something that I was just having to say robotically time and time and time again. It wasn't genuine.
Yeah. And I think it makes people really uncomfortable to think about that. Like I said earlier, I believe we have the treatments exist. I believe treatments exist. I believe we have incredible practitioners that need to be elevated, and we need to overhaul the space. It's funny. So I agree with you. Not everybody will recover. Not everybody can recover because of their circumstances, because of where they live. They may not be safe. They may not, they might be in poverty. They might be, you know, a whole myriad of reasons why. I believe that if eating disorder treatment worked the way that it should, that I believe we would see a much higher rate of recovery. And I think that I would believe in everybody can recover, complete sentence. I would believe in that a lot more.
Yeah.
Because there is, I guess, an essence of, yeah, I do believe that, but they can't, but they're not going to, because they can't access the treatment. They can't get, they aren't safe. They're not in safe accommodation. They don't have the basic, you know, needs met. How are they going to?
They can't afford treatment.
They can't afford treatment. Like, can we talk about community care? We know how many gaps there are, like people in the community, like we talk about these hospital spaces and treatment in the hospital space, but like let's talk about community care, because most people actually can't afford that.
Yeah.
And most people do recover in community care. Like, people don't recover in a hospital bed.
No, I don't think I've ever met anyone that recovered in hospital. Like, it's just not a real, like, it's not.
Yeah.
So why are we throwing funding that way? Anyway, that's a whole nother conversation. But I've said it to you a few times, Nic, like, I feel like it actually is simple. Like, it's actually not difficult.
It's common sense, isn't it? Like
it is. Like, it is. Like, it's not that hard.
No, it's not. And like, the amount of people that, you know, have done my training, or that I talk to, or, you know, that I supervise or provide consultation for, the amount of people who throughout that discussion have said to me, like, it's common sense, it's pretty simple. I'm like, yeah, that's the point.
Yeah.
I love that you brought up your training, because that's something I definitely wanted to talk to you about, without giving too much information away, because obviously we want people and clinicians to actively engage with your program and compensate you, you know, appropriately. But yeah, without giving too much information away for free, can you tell us a little bit about what a fat positive practice is and your fat positive framework, and how did you come to start it?
It's funny, really. I tend to do a lot of my creative processes when I'm really angry. Anger for me is a motive, like, it's an emotion that actually motivates me to get shit done. Which I get angry a lot, so I tend to be quite creative.
I love that. I get angry a lot, so I tend to be quite creative. We need that. You need to make that an Instagram post, or like a slogan. Can we make that like a t-shirt?
So the fat positive framework was something that was born out of a hell of a lot of frustration, because I was just seeing so much shit on social media and out there in the field of, you know, just gold standard treatments and the boring old stuff we've been doing for so freaking long that just doesn't work. Like, I get so many messages from people that land in my inbox to say, eating disorder treatment for me has been really harmful. The amount of messages like that I get, it's inconceivable. When you're getting that many messages from so many different people that you've never met before, it's hard to think that, like, it has to be a problem with the system, right? Like, once there are so many people that are speaking up about it, it has to be a problem with the system. So
absolutely,
I pondered and conceptualized for a while, and I was like, I don't want to put together another treatment approach or another manualized treatment or another, you know, prescriptive way of doing things. I want to put together a practice framework that literally is the bare minimum that people should be doing. Instead of it being a top-down, power-over, prescriptive, rigid treatment manual, what I've asked of this framework is that it is a bottom-up framework, and it asks a lot of the clinicians actually working with clients to do their own work in reckoning with and interrogating their own biases, you know, that they hold, particularly against people in bigger bodies, but with people who exist in the margins for whatever reason.
Which is where the responsibility should lie.
Yes. Exactly. And this framework is informed and guided by lived experience. It aims to de-expert the clinician, and it takes the power away from the clinician, and it gives back agency to the people that are accessing support. And the overarching kind of themes of it is that it is trauma-informed, it's weight inclusive, and that it focuses on actually looking at the ways in which systemic discrimination or oppression affect a person. And that forms the basis of the work that people do with their support team. Like, that doesn't sound unreasonable.
No. It's like, it seems like it should be standard. Like, that's the stuff that should be done.
It seems like a no-brainer.
Right? Like,
I know that you have pointed some things out to me in the past, Nic, and it's kind of like, cool, all right, like, thank you for letting me know that. And that's what it needs to be, like, not arc up. It's not an attack on you as a person. Your response to that is what is the most important thing, I believe. Like, everybody is going to do harm in some way, shape, or form. We're not perfect humans. We are going to do harm, but it's then your response to that
Absolutely.
that is the most important thing.
I think we've also been seeing it very much over the last few years as well, is this concept of systemic racism and unlearning the racism that has pretty much informed our entire lives, since jump. And then also at the same time, now it's how do you look at other systemic biases such as anti-fat bias and this inherent bias that I think so many of us have. It's been, for me personally, I definitely grew up in an anti-fat household, and it was, having to then just unlearn all of that. Why do I think this way? Why is that my initial reaction when I see a fat person? That's not right. That's not who I want to be. How do you challenge that? So I guess things like your Instagram and your social presence has been so crucial for things like that, and having people speak up and actually vocalize, hey, these are my stories. This is what I experienced. This is what is happening to so many people, and this is not okay.
Yeah.
So how important has social media been for you in terms of spreading your message and awareness? And for those who don't follow Nic, you should absolutely do that. Her Instagram handle is at nic.mcdermid. So go follow her right now.
Social media for me has been a real it's been a real ride, if I can use that term.
Absolutely, you can.
Don't worry, there is a follow-up question about the other side of it. Don't worry.
It's been a bit of a wild ride. I'll go through stages of getting a lot of engagement and a lot of response to a lot of the stuff that I post, but then I post something that's kind of remotely controversial, or that, not names and shames, but basically like points out the really disgusting behavior in certain spaces and places. And that tends to get me cancelled. I hate that term cancelled, but it tends to be like an influx of people that feel that they have a right to message me, and
that didn't happen.
Yeah. Like, for example, I'll use the universal definition of recovery. I was not shy in saying that was something that originated from Carolyn Costin through the 8 Keys to Recovery from an Eating Disorder book, through all of, like the Montenegro work and that sort of thing. And unfortunately, a lot of treatment models here have been built on those foundations. And so therefore, the inevitable. And so I made comment of the fact that the 8 Keys to Recovery book and the universal definition of recovery is actually really harmful for people who don't fit the stereotypical mold of an eating disorder.
Mm-hmm.
Hence the influx of messages from all over the world. Carolyn saved my life. How dare you talk badly about her? She did this, she did that. And I'm like, great, fantastic. I'm really glad that she saved your life. Yeah. But for me, that's
people really struggle with the concept of two things being able to be true at once. Like, you weren't saying that she hasn't helped you. You weren't saying that she hasn't done any good work. You weren't saying that, even her book isn't helpful for some people. Can absolutely acknowledge that it is, and has, the work that she has done has helped people. But however,
absolutely,
it has also harmed people. And that's this problem we have within the space as well, I think, is this black and white thinking of feeling like you're attacking because you're saying that is harmful for a group of people because it worked for you. Well, that's not what I'm saying at all.
Like, it needs to come with a caveat that whilst some people may find this helpful, for a whole bunch of other people, it's not.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Given that we're talking about the influx of hatred that kind of tends to come your way, and it's definitely not uncommon for fat creators or fat activists or anyone who decides to challenge the
or just exist on social media
bias.
In a
well, yeah. Why do you think this backlash exists, and what do you do to protect yourself from it?
Oh gosh, why does it exist? I think because people are so, like any amount of reasons, I think because people are so confronted and so uncomfortable with, their own beliefs being challenged, perhaps with, somebody being unapologetic and not backing down about highlighting the harms that exist within spaces that, that basically call people out on their bullshit and ask people to be accountable for what they do, and and how they work with people and what they put out there, and what they share, and asking people to be accountable with their friends and their family in terms of shutting down any talk about any discriminatory talk or behavior that occurs, not just with fat people, but in terms of racism, homophobia. We mentioned so many of those intersections before. Yeah, like calling out the inherent harms in so many situations. I think people get really uncomfortable, and people get angry and defensive because it's something that does ring so true for them, because it's something that they may have been believing or engaging in or doing for their entire life, that when you actually confront people with it, and like I don't sugarcoat things on social media. I don't dilute my content to make other people feel comfortable. And I don't dilute my content with the fear that people might not like me. I put it out there with the hope that it does make people uncomfortable. Because when you make people uncomfortable, it gets them considering why.
That's where change can happen.
Exactly.
Yeah. But in saying that, it hasn't come without consequences. And unfortunately, I do get a lot of backlash online. I get a lot of people messaging me, a lot of just complete and utter filth in terms of anti-fat hatred. And, there was a period of time last year where for about 4 days straight, I was literally getting people messaging me telling me that I shouldn't be alive anymore and that I should take my own life, or that they were going to come and, sexually assault me. It was utterly disgusting. It's odd that, everybody's solution to that is a solution that involves me stepping away and disengaging from my community.
Yeah.
And I have more of a community online in terms of fellow folk who share the same values, fellow fat folk, etc., etc. More of a community online than what I do in real life. And that is a space that I don't want to step away from when I'm having a hard time.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
When people suggest that you step away from a space to try and, nullify that awful behavior, it's very victim blamey. Like, it's very like,
walk away and be the bigger person. It's like, no.
I've been the bigger person my entire freaking life. So, like, that shit doesn't fly with me, really.
Yeah, but exactly right. Exactly right.
One thing that I do think definitely needs to happen in general is, to help challenge their own anti-fat bias. And one great way to do that is to follow, fat creators and fat activists online. You are an excellent place to start. Who are some other people that you could recommend that other people follow in order to get more of this conversation on their feeds, like, and start challenging themselves? Like, where are the places that they should go?
Or other resources even.
That too.
I think, but before I kind of jump into that, we've spoken a lot about anti-fatness, and, you mentioned the inherent racism, obviously, that also exists in our society. I did want to make mention of the fact that there is such a strong correlation, and anti-fatness and racism are inherently tied together. And anti-fatness was born out of essentially requesting that fat Black women lose weight and not be Black.
Yeah. So we actually spoke about that yesterday with Aubrey, didn't we? Yeah.
Yeah, she recommended the book Fearing the Black Body.
Absolutely.
By Sabrina Strings, yeah. So that, yeah, you're exactly right.
I'm sorry, I'm going on a bit of a tangent, but like,
That's
I
fine.
think for myself as a white fat activist as well, I always have to remember to go back to the roots of anti-fatness and my privilege. Even though I'm a fat person that is at the receiving end from a hell of a lot of anti-fatness and fat hate and discrimination, I'm also white, so I benefit in that space as well.
Absolutely.
And so, yeah, I think that's kind of a good lead in to say that, you know, privilege and oppression, they don't exist, you know, irrespective of the other. You can be wholly privileged in one area of your life, but also experience oppression and marginalization in others.
So important.
Yeah, and we don't experience aspects of our identity individually, we experience them collectively.
Yeah.
And so, you know, holding the duality of the fact that you may be incredibly privileged in a situation that you are also oppressed in. So, me being white and fat, my fatness being the oppression, but my whiteness also being the privilege that lays alongside that. Yes, sorry, I just felt that was an important bit to share.
No.
But going back to the resources, I think, you know, there are a hell of a lot of incredible fat Black creators that are online and unapologetic. And I think I also feel quite protective when I'm asked about resources and that sort of thing, because I also don't want to give people the answers. I want people to be able to find things for themselves.
Yep. I like it.
So I will say, go to, you know, pages like mine and find the people that I follow, or go to other fat Black creators pages and find the people that they follow, and start to follow people who are inherently different from yourself.
I really like that.
I do, however, have a list of books that has like 40 books or something.
We love it.
A lot of them to do, like, obviously Fearing the Black Body is one of them by Sabrina Strings, and then Belly of the Beast by Deshaun Harrison is another incredible book that looks at the ties between anti-fatness and anti-Blackness. In the list of books that I've got, there's also a lot of books that delve into the relationship between the LGBTQIA plus community and anti-fatness, that looks at like queering embodiment as a theme. Yeah, like the things like the Fat Studies Reader and that sort of thing, which, yeah, is just incredible. So I'll send through the list of those books.
That'd be amazing.
In terms of like people actually finding people to follow online,
start at you and explore.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
I like that.
And
excellent advice. Yeah.
Like, it's part of that responsibility that I allude to in the fat positive practice framework as well. Like, that is part of creating a fat positive space and a fat positive environment where fat people aren't being given the burden of having to educate all the time.
Yeah.
People actually accepting responsibility for educating themselves. And it's like, I don't have an issue when people have kind of walked away and engaged in content and, you know, have done some of the work, but then still might have a question.
Yeah, totally.
Come to me with those questions. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But like, do the work to explore and investigate before you come to me wanting all the answers.
Yeah, absolutely agree.
Absolutely. Lastly, and I know that we could talk for ages, but I'm very conscious of not just the editing time I'm going to have to do, but of your very precious time. We always like to end on a positive note around here. So can you tell us right now, what is bringing you some joy?
Oh my God. Okay. So I
can tell this is going to be good already.
I am such a Taylor Swift fan.
Yes.
Such a Taylor Swift fan. It's like I've probably come back into my enjoyment of Taylor Swift over the last couple of months, where I have allowed myself to stim freely to her music in my lounge room and just move my body in a way that feels really good. For a long time, there was a lot of shame associated with that, and, you know, a lot of shame kind of within the whole being an older millennial liking Taylor Swift anyway.
God forbid.
I know.
One of the worst things ever is people who make other people feel bad for the things that they love and make them happy.
I'm not forcing you to like it, just let me be.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's like, it's a terrible thing to do.
Oh, absolutely.
You are going to Taylor Swift's concert, please tell me yes.
No, I didn't get tickets.
Oh.
If there's anyone out there that has a spare Taylor Swift ticket for Sydney, and you're willing to sell it, hit me up.
I'm sad for you. I'm sorry I asked that question. I feel like I've just opened a wound.
Well, thank you so much, Nic, for joining us. This has been so helpful, so informative, and like I said, we could chat for hours, and something tells me that this might not be the last time we have you on here, because you have been such a joy. As I mentioned, you can follow Nic out on her Instagram at nic.mcdermid. The link is in the show notes below. And if you want to know more about the Fat Positive Framework, go to our website, nicmcdermid.com, also in the show notes. And if you keep an eye on our socials, I have a feeling something very special is about to be announced, which is the Fat Positive Collective.
I'm like actually so excited.
We're very excited to see what's coming up for you. So yeah, thank you so much. And we should definitely chat again soon. It has been so, so wonderful.
Thank you so much for having me. And I would be happy to come back anytime.
Yeah.
Careful, we will hold you to that.
I'm sorry you said that.
Yeah, it's been so good to record a podcast again. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a blast.
Oh, it's been our absolute pleasure. That's all for today's podcast. Thank you so much for listening. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to subscribe to make sure you don't miss an episode. And if you feel like leaving us a cheeky review, we'd love if you do that. It would really help us with the podcast. Follow us on Instagram at pavedwithgoldpod. Send us a Gmail at pavedwithgoldpod@gmail.com. or visit our website, pavedwithgoldpodcast.com. All of those links will be in the show notes along with extra resources. And until next time, stay safe and we'll talk to you again soon. Bye.
Bye.
This podcast is general in nature and has not taken your personal circumstances or medical history into account. We are here to share our own experiences and the things that we have found helpful throughout our own personal recovery journeys. Please remember that each person's journey and circumstances are different, and not all of the information contained in this podcast may be relatable to you. It's important you consult your own GP or recovery team to seek out tailored advice before making any important decisions relating to your own health and recovery process. If you have found any of the content in this episode distressing, please contact your care team or a medical professional. If you or someone you know is in crisis and needs help now, please contact emergency services in your region immediately.